Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. You may not have thought about it before, but time zones are strange. They're weird. What are time zones, and why do we use them? Who decided the world should be loosely split into 24 different regions with 24 different times? Why do some countries and territories decide to change or make their own time zones? Where are the strangest time zones in the world? Let's try to answer these questions in this episode of Thinking in English. But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, or the link is in the description. It's full of some great vocabulary content and some extra bonus stuff. And definitely take a look at my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, where you can find the transcript and some other useful information. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. To pick up. To pick up. This means to buy something cheaply. As in, I picked up a new computer for a great price in the sale. Downright. Downright. Downright is an adjective and adverb, which means extremely or very great. For instance, she's being downright unhelpful and obstructive. Loosely. Loosely. Not exactly. For instance, this phrase can be loosely translated as go away. To adjust. To adjust. If you adjust something, you change it slightly to make it fit, work better, or be suitable. As in, you should adjust your phone's screen brightness late at night. To adopt. To adopt. To adopt means to accept or start to use something new. As in, we will have to adopt a more scientific approach in the future. Longitude. Longitude. This word is not necessarily important, but I think it's useful to know. It's the distance of a place, east or west, of an imaginary line between the North Pole and the South Pole, which goes right through the middle of London in a place called Greenwich. And this distance is measured in degrees. So sometimes when you watch TV shows or movies, they will talk about how many degrees a location is, and that is the location's longitude. For instance, Harrison invented one of the world's most accurate clocks ever, which allowed sailors to determine their longitude for the first time. Enclave. Enclave. An enclave is a part of a country that is surrounded by another country. For instance, Kaliningrad is a Russian enclave surrounded completely by Lithuania, Poland, and the sea. It is not connected to the major part of Russia. Autonomous. Autonomous. An autonomous organization, country, or region is independent and has the freedom to govern itself. As in, that region is autonomous and makes its own decisions about tax, education, and healthcare. If you follow my Instagram, and you all should, you might have seen the new clock I picked up at a local second-hand store. I love watches, clocks, and timepieces, and this clock instantly attracted my attention in the shop. It is made by Citizen, a well-known Japanese brand, but that is not what attracted me. Instead, it was the design that caught my eye. The clock has something known as a world time complication. Basically, this means that as well as telling the time in my location, it also has a ring of numbers from 1 to 24, which rotates once a day. In combination with some names of international cities written around the outside of the clock, this rotating ring allows you to tell the time in every time zone around the world. I'll try to attach a photo of the clock on my blog if you're confused by my description. I think I'm confused by my description. However, although I said the clock allows you to tell the time in every time zone in the world, it doesn't really. I kind of lied. This is because time zones are weird. If time zones were perfect, well, the clock would also be fine. But time zones are not perfect. And some are downright confusing. Take my own country, the UK. I'm currently in Japan. So when I want to know what time it is in the UK, maybe so I can call my parents, I can just take a quick look at my new special clock to see what time it is at home, right? Well, kind of. The clock lists the UK, or London, I guess, as being GMT, and I'll explain this a little later. GMT is 9 hours behind the current Japanese time. However, the UK is not 9 hours behind Japan right now. UK uses daylight savings hours, which means that currently the UK is 8 hours behind Japanese time, not 9. So the clock I bought, even though it says all the time zones in the world, is not really helping me right now. And this is not even close to being the strangest time zone in the world. Hopefully, by the end of this episode, you will understand what a time zone is, the history of time zones and why they exist, and you will know some of the strangest and most complicated time zones in the world. I will also mention daylight savings hours a lot during this episode. Now, if you get confused by this, don't worry, because I actually recorded a podcast a few months ago about this very topic. So I'll leave a link in the description of the podcast and also on my blog for you to check out. A time zone is a region of the planet with a standard or common time. Every place, every country, every city, every town in that time zone has the same time. The time is used for all purposes within the time zone, for business, legal, and social events. The Earth is divided loosely into 24 regions or time zones. And depending on which way you travel around the world, time moves forward or backward, 1 hour for each time zone. This is the general rule, because as we see later, time zones are not always so simple. Countries are actually free to pick their own time, and although many follow the basic 24 regions, some countries have decided not to, of course. Although you probably rarely think about time zones, unless you're traveling or living abroad, they actually play a vital role in world affairs, trade, and globalization. If you were alive 200 years ago, you would be living in a world without standard times. It was common for individual towns to have their own local time that citizens and businesses would follow. This meant that if you traveled from your hometown to another city, then it was quite likely that you would have to adjust your watch once you arrived. Some cities built large clock towers to display the local time, but this was not guaranteed, and it was not always obvious what the time was. For most of our history, this didn't really matter. Traveling was not as common as it is now. People did not usually have clocks or watches and instead based their lives off daylight instead of hours. And even if you did travel, it was quite slow. It was only with the development of faster transport, and especially the train, that people began to notice the problems of having many different local times. For example, in the 19th century, a train could leave Paris at 1 p.m., travel for 2 hours to Le Mans, about 200 kilometers away, and arrive at 2 p.m. This meant that every time passengers took this train, they needed to change their watches and clocks by 1 hour. Because although the two cities were not that far away from each other, they were 1 hour different. There is also a famous story of a British businessman traveling by train from London to, I think it's Birmingham, and he missed his return train by a few minutes because Birmingham's time was a few minutes different to London's time. As train travel became more common and popular, standardized times began to be adopted and discussed internationally. If you want to make a national train timetable or schedule, a standard time is essential. How can you make a list of all the times of trains in the whole country if every town has a different time? If you have a meeting in another city at 3 p.m., you want to make sure that 3 p.m. is the same as your 3 p.m. Otherwise, you might miss the meeting. A Canadian engineer called Sanford Fleming, or Sir Sanford Fleming, he was the first person to propose the idea of worldwide time zones in 1878. He suggested that we split the world into 24 regions that were each 15 degrees of longitude apart. The Earth rotates once a day, or in other words, it rotates 360 degrees in one day. This means that every hour, the world rotates 15 degrees, making it the natural way to create time zones. In 1884, a conference in the USA was held to standardize international time and choose something called the prime meridian. Now, the prime meridian, this vocabulary I don't think is essential, but basically it is an imaginary line, north-south line, that divides the world in half. It is used to calculate the locations of all other time zones in the world. Basically, it is the 0-degree line, and every other time zone is counted by how many degrees different it is to that line. The conference in the USA chose the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London, as the official prime meridian. So the line that stretches from the North Pole through London, through Greenwich, down to the South Pole is 0 degrees. As the UK was already an international and colonial power during the 19th century, most of the world's shipping companies already used Greenwich time to set their clocks. And Greenwich also had a reputation as a place of very accurate timekeeping. And so Greenwich Mean Time, also known as GMT, was selected. This is why all other time zones are written in reference to GMT. For example, I am in Tokyo, and if you search Tokyo's time zone, it will say GMT plus 9, while New York is GMT minus 4. Increasingly, the term UTC is being used instead of GMT. So you might see UTC written instead. This system means that, in theory, it is much easier to coordinate business or activities across the world, as you will always know what the time is. When I flew from England to Japan, I knew that it was GMT plus 9, so I could set my watch on the plane, for example. Time zones are now a fundamental part of our world. At least 23 countries actually have more than one time zone. I've got a question for you all. Do you know which country has the most time zones? I'll give you a few seconds to think about the answer. And a quick hint, it is probably not what you expect. The answer is France. France. Thanks to its numerous overseas territories, which span from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, France actually has 12 different time zones. You might have guessed Russia, which is very close and has 11 time zones, and the USA has 9 official time zones and 2 unofficial ones. Some countries don't follow the exact 1-hour time zones and instead use half or quarter hours instead. So now let's talk about some of the strangest or weirdest time zones in the world. The first place to start is China. You all know China is a massive country, but confusingly, the Chinese government only uses one time zone. In 1949, as an attempt to promote national unity across the whole territory, Beijing time, so GMT plus 8, was chosen to be the official time zone of everywhere. This does, however, create some unique problems in the west of the country, where the sun might rise at 10 a.m. and set at midnight. It can also be confusing depending on who you talk to. I found an interesting example from an Atlantic article written a few years ago. Imagine a friend inviting you for coffee at 3 p.m. If you live in the western Chinese province of Xinjiang, this is not a straightforward invitation. If your friend is from China's majority Han ethnicity, 3 o'clock would mean the official national time, or 3 o'clock Beijing time. However, if your friend is a Uyghur, the largest ethnic minority group in Xinjiang, he might be referring to unofficial local time, which is 2 hours behind. Afghanistan shares a border with Xinjiang province in China. Although it is a very small border and very highly protected, if you managed to somehow cross from Afghanistan to China, you would be jumping forward 3.5 hours. The time difference from Afghanistan to China is 3.5 hours, or 1 step. The time differences between China and its other neighbors, so for example, Pakistan is 3 hours, India 2.5 hours, Nepal 2 hours and 15 minutes, Bhutan is 2 hours, and Myanmar is 90 minutes, and the Russian Far East is 2 or 3 hours depending on which time zone you cross into or from. They're also all very extreme and large. Crossing these borders jumps you forward or backwards a large amount of time. However, if you cross from India to Nepal, it's only 15-minute time difference. Nepal's time is UTC plus 5.75. This makes it one of only 3 time zones with a 45-minute deviance. The others are New Zealand's Chatham Islands and the tiny central western time zone of Western Australia, which I will mention again shortly. The Kaliningrad Oblast enclave, which is the part of Russia not connected to the rest of the country, is an hour ahead of Lithuania to its east and 2 hours ahead of Poland, despite being completely surrounded by these 2 countries. Although some US states follow daylight savings hours, Arizona doesn't, and it sticks to mountain time zone all year round. However, if you travel through the territory of the Navajo Nation, which is a semi-autonomous Native American territory mainly in Arizona, they do follow daylight savings hours. So, the part of Arizona owned by the Navajo may be a different time. Even more confusing, within the Navajo Nation territory is another Native American tribe's land, the Hopi Reservation. The Hopi don't observe daylight savings hours. Therefore, driving through Arizona can result in repeatedly switching time zones back and forth as you cross from Arizonan land to Navajo land to Hopi land. In Australia, there is a kind of one city with 2 time zones, Not exactly one city, but almost. Tweed Heads is the furthest north of New South Wales, and it merges into Coolangatta, which is the very south of Queensland. For half the year, they have the same time, but Queensland observes daylight savings hours, while New South Wales doesn't. This place has now become known as a good destination for a New Year's Eve party. You can celebrate once in Tweed Heads before walking to Coolangatta to celebrate the new year again. Australia is actually full of weird time zones. The town of Broken Hill in New South Wales follows South Australia time instead, while Eucla, near the border of Western Australia and South Australia, doesn't follow either territory's time zones. Instead, it is 45 minutes different. There are countless examples of interesting time zones, but one final one I want to briefly talk about is the interesting case of Samoa and Tokelau. These Pacific islands are located close by the international date line. This is the line where the date changes. If you are to the east of the date line, you will share the same day as the Americas, while if you are to the west of the date line, you will share the same day as Australia, New Zealand, and East Asia. On the 29th of December 2011, Samoa and Tokelau jumped from the US side of the line to the Asian side of the line. The result was that they completely missed the 30th of December. The 30th of December 2011 never happened in Samoa or Tokelau. The two island territories made the decision to change as they wanted to make trade easier with Australia and New Zealand, which are probably the most important partners for many Pacific countries. Before the change, while Samoans were enjoying their Sunday days off, it was already Monday in Australia and New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands were missing out on a whole day of business. Interestingly, this was not the first time Samoa has changed dates. 129 years ago, they did the exact opposite, and they moved to the same side of the international date line as the United States in an effort to aid trade. So here is today's final thought. On today's episode of Thinking in English, I have tried to introduce the ideas and history behind the existence of time zones, as well as highlighting some confusing, strange, and problem-causing time zones around the world. As I mentioned, I don't have enough time or energy to mention every strange time zone in the world. But I would love it if you could tell me if your country has any strange times. Does your country have more than one official time? Can you think of any more examples around the world? Do you think all countries should follow the standard 24-hour regions? Or is it okay to let countries decide their own time zone? What do you think? Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review or rating, recommend it to your friends, or let me know on Instagram. My Instagram is Thinking in English Podcast. The link should be in the description. And make sure you check out the Thinking in English blog. I love hearing from listeners, and I really appreciate all of the messages I have received over the past few months. Feel free to send me a message or give me some advice or recommend a topic. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.